right, welcome to the second episode of the Real Jesus Experience. Today we've got Pastor Steve, actually Dr. Steve Bezner from HNW Church. That's Houston Northwest Church. He is also the author of Your Jesus is Too American, Calling the Church to Reclaim Kingdom Values Over the American Dream. And that is out in October, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And I believe you can pre-order that at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Baker Books. So get your copy reserved right now. All right. Welcome to the podcast.
Chad, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So a couple questions just right off the bat. We'll just do some rapid fire.
Yeah.
So you just had your 25th anniversary.
Yes. Just had my 25th anniversary. Married to an amazing woman. And the fact that she's put up with me for 25 years is part of that evidence. So, yeah, absolutely.
All right. And you got two boys that are both out of the house?
They're both out of the house. Ben is 23. Andrew is 20. Mm-hmm. And Ben is in seminary, and Drew is a sophomore in college.
Nice. What's that like now, having an empty house after all that testosterone left?
Oh, man. It took us a minute to adjust. I think just, you get to that phase of life where you're chasing your kids and doing all their activities, and then just suddenly that's over. And it was really, really quick. But in the at men's Bible study, I was a little nervous about this right before Andrew graduated, or left the house rather. And I said to one of the men at our table group who's retired, I said, yeah, we're about to be an empty nester. I'm a little nervous about that. Do you have any advice? And this older gentleman looked at me and said, yeah, it took me a good 5 minutes to adjust. So I was like, okay. And I think he was onto something. It took us a minute, but man, if you get to go on dates again, you're not worried about babysitting.
Amen.
Our biggest thing is just somebody to feed the dog if we decide to be gone too long. That's it. So it's pretty great. Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. So you are kind of a audiophile, maybe.
I love it. Yes,
Okay.
I am.
And you've got a thing for vinyl and jazz.
I do. So the jazz thing was really, I guess, what got me into vinyl. I wouldn't say I have a ton of other vinyls, but that particular genre, for some reason, I don't know, I guess maybe nostalgia. It's just kind of fun to throw it onto a turntable and listen to and kind of get the crackle and that sort of thing of vinyl. So I love going to like yard sales or getting on eBay and just finding like particularly classic jazz, maybe from like the 50s, 60s. Yeah, I love it. It's a lot of fun.
Have you ever checked out the online estate sale auctions?
No, but you're about to ruin my life. I can tell.
One of the guys in our church got me turned on to it a little bit, and I've kind of gone down a rabbit hole.
Okay, I didn't even know about this.
There was one I was just looking at, and there's got to be hundreds of vinyl records. Hundreds. And they'll probably go for about $3 a stack.
Oh, my gosh.
So I will find the link. I think the auction's still active, but I'll send it to you, and you can check it out.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah. And I'm sorry for opening up that door.
Sorry, babe.
Yeah. All right. So college sports or pro sports?
So that's kind of interesting. I for the longest time it was pro, but more recently it's been college.
What caused that shift?
I'm not really sure. I think the more that I watch college sports, of course, things have changed recently, but for a long time, it wasn't about money.
Right.
It was just kids playing because they love the game. And I think there was something that felt a little more pure about that as opposed to it being a business transaction.
Yeah.
Also, particularly with college football, college basketball, I just feel like the energy in some of those venues is just off the charts.
Right.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah. And your favorite team is your alma mater?
Well, sort of. I mean, I went to a tiny little college in Abilene, so yes, but none of their games are broadcast. So, where I went to grad school, though, I went to Baylor, and so I become a Baylor football and basketball fan. Football is normally not good news, but basketball is pretty fun to watch. So yeah.
Right on. So you got kind of two other hobbies or passions. One being barbecue.
Oh, man.
And then the other one, just exploring Houston, which for our listeners that don't know, where this podcast is based in Houston, Texas. So those two things probably go like a little bit hand in hand. No?
Absolutely. Yeah, they do.
Okay. So I gotta get your number one recommendation for barbecue.
Okay. Probably this is my opinion, probably the best I've had in the Houston area is Corkscrew Barbecue, which is in
I've
Old Town
heard that.
Spring. It's
Yeah.
really, really good. One that's a little more off the beaten path is Gatlin's Barbecue. Have you had that? So
not.
Gatlin's is like in the Heights, and it's family owned and operated, and a little like surprising sides. Different kind of almost like a soul food genre type. So
Oh,
pretty good.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What's like a hidden gem in Houston that you found aside from food?
Ooh, great questions. Okay, so a couple of things. One, there's a little college called St. Thomas College, and there's a chapel that is on their campus. And that chapel has the most interesting three-dimensional sculptures of the Stations of the Cross.
Oh,
So if that's something that you're into, I think it's really, really cool. So I think that that's really, really fun. And, man, kind of put me on the spot here. I'm trying to think of another just fun place that we like. I would say probably the coffee shops in Houston that we've really enjoyed. I guess that is food still technically, but we've really enjoyed finding some of those. And now, for the people who live in Houston, this is not that big of a deal, but the West End Church has a coffee shop inside of it. I guess it used to maybe be their fellowship hall, and they just turned that into a coffee shop. It's really cool. And Joy and I, if you're ever like doing a into town date, we like to go there.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, as you know, our goal here is to share testimony in order for people to see what it looks like to get up to, encounter, and through the wall that all believers, if they're growing and maturing, will eventually hit. And so that all kind of starts back at the beginning, because all of those things that pour into us kind of make us who we are and create the things that God then later has to strip out. So maybe let's start with where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little town called Gainesville, Texas. Gainesville is right on the Red River, close to Oklahoma. Population kind of in the 14 to 15,000 area.
Okay. And what was the atmosphere when you were growing up in terms of family, church attendance, like that kind of thing?
Yeah, so Gainesville is definitely kind of a blue-collar town. Lots of folks who work in the oil field in that area. Several of my family members did work in the oil field. My mom and dad were divorced whenever I was young. I was 6, but for at least a few years, they were both in Gainesville. And so family was really close, able to see everyone pretty easily. Both sets of grandparents lived very nearby, able to see them, aunts and uncles nearby. So family was definitely a big part of growing up. Church attendance, whenever my parents were divorced, so growing up went to First Baptist Gainesville. And then whenever my parents were divorced, because of the custody agreement, I would go to the Baptist church one weekend and then the Catholic church the next weekend. So that was sort of an interesting experience.
No kidding.
As a kid, definitely seeing different sides of the Christian faith. But there was never any doubt in either household that Jesus was important.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really good. So you said your parents split. How did that kind of impact you as a child?
Yeah. So I think that a few ways. So I think as a kid, I think that I would say that it sort of brought me to a point where I understood that family was maybe a little more fragile than maybe some of my friends thought. It was one of those things where you recognized that marriage is tender. Marriage is something that can fall apart. And it also sort of taught me the importance of mediating conflict. One of the things that I saw was that I wanted to be someone who would seek to understand both sides of an issue and to try to be able to explain that. That's probably a personality characteristic I've carried with me into adulthood, to be able to have an opinion, to understand what I think about something, but to also really be able to say, oh, I understand what it is that you're trying to communicate. So I think that's probably a second thing. I think that, then moving forward, it made me passionate about trying to help people struggling in their marriages. Just because I think that as a child, it affected me in some ways emotionally. And I think that we tend to underestimate what those effects are, particularly for the adult children of divorce. I don't think that we often understand how hard that is and the things that you have to sort through with that. And I know that every marriage is different and every situation is different, but I really work hard to try and help people reconcile if possible, because I do think that it has consequences that people probably don't understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So just to make sure that we don't skip by this part, how old were you when you got saved?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I came to saving faith in Jesus when I was 6. And then I would tell you that I had another experience many years later when I was 22, when I would say the understanding of God's grace became so overwhelming to me. I would say I was already saved, but wow, I had a moment where I really began to understand just how deep God's love was for me. And I don't know if you can relate to that, but
Absolutely. I'm curious though, was that realization before or after you crossed your wall?
it was before my wall,
Okay.
which was surprising to me. But I think that if I wouldn't have had that realization, going through the wall would have been almost impossible.
And that's exactly, I've kind of got this theory that there has to be a certain amount of growth before God's like, because you know how when Abraham took Isaac up the mountain,
Yeah.
right? And he raises the knife and God says, whoa, fella, like I see your faithfulness. And then we see in the New Testament that it was counted to him as righteousness. So there's this idea that I've got where like we've got to kind of step towards God in obedience before God will say, okay, I see your heart. Let's go for it and let's do this together. And then puts you through the ringer to get rid of kind of some of the junk that's there. But that's just my personal theory.
No, I think you're onto something, Chad, because I think that you need to know you're completely loved and completely accepted. And then once you understand that, whenever pain comes, you don't misinterpret it as hatred. But somehow it's part of, like you were saying, that purification process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's not jump too far ahead. So 6 years old,
Yeah.
were you splitting your time between Catholic and Baptist at that point?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not 100% sure that I can remember exactly.
Okay.
I think it was after my parents had already divorced, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay. And was it in the Baptist church?
It was in
Okay.
the Baptist church. I remember the pastor from the church came to visit us in our home. Apparently I'd been asking my mom a lot of questions about faith. And so she, I think, felt like I was too young. And so the pastor came by and sat with us. And I think finally was like, I think he understands as best as a 6-year-old can understand. And so if he wants to come to faith, then I think you should let him. And so she did. And I professed my faith in Christ and was baptized. So I think that's sort of an interesting testimony in the sense that most of my story has been a person of faith, but growing in that for most of my life, trying to figure it out, I guess, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what's your position on that then? Is it like an individual case-by-case basis when it comes to the age of, somebody making that declaration?
Yeah, I think that with kids particularly, what we tend to say is if kids are asking lots and lots of questions, that's God working in their heart. So I think that, the pendulum has probably swung the other direction, and we probably almost stop kids sometimes because we feel like they're too young, they don't understand. We got to have a class, we got to read a book, let's wait till they're older. And I think that there's plenty of wisdom behind that. But I do think that if children understand and we can't figure out why, or if we can't find any reason to think that they don't understand, I don't know that there's a reason to stop them. I think that if children love the Lord, and a lot of kids do, and they're ready to place their faith, I think that's okay.
All right. So I'm just going to pick your brain for selfish reasons. In our house, what we've done is if you, are asking those questions and you're asking about baptism, you need to be able to tell me why you're being baptized and what it means.
I think that's totally fair.
Okay.
And at 6, I don't know that I could have said much more than Jesus died to save me from my sin. That probably would have been about it. I think that that's one of the other things that Cassidy, who's our family minister at our church, talks about is, do they have the level of faith that makes sense for a person of that age? And so I think that if your children can explain that in a way that makes sense for someone their age, I think you're good.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So come to faith at 6. So then obviously like you're an angel from then until you hit 22.
Right.
No?
No,
Oh.
maybe a little bit of non-angel time.
So what's going on in Gainesville then?
Yeah. So I think that I definitely I was a church kid. I definitely loved the Lord, but I think that like anybody, I had teenage years where I wasn't in outright rebellion or anything like that, but definitely girls became way more important to me than Jesus did. Definitely looking back, made some poor decisions with friends. May or may not have been involved in some vandalistic acts, that sort of thing. Maybe some other things that broke the law. But I think that it was more of mischief, if that makes sense. Maybe small town boredom rather than out and out rebellion against the Lord. But I think that the thing when I look back is that my faith was very much cultural. Everybody in my little world of Gainesville, Texas, believed in Jesus. It was difficult for me to envision anyone who wouldn't believe in Jesus. We read about missionaries and that sort of thing, talking to people on the other side of the world. But in my part of the world, I thought, well, everybody believes in Jesus. I think that was why later, after college, whenever I had my horizons expanded a bit, that then was the moment when the understanding of God's grace in my life became so palpable. And so it's this sense of, wow, I have been truly blessed, to have someone who loves me in this way. And that's probably kind of the way that came to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of guy is Steve in high school? Are you on the sports teams, lettering?
No. Well, let me rephrase. I was on some sport teams. That doesn't mean I was any good. Again, small town.
Right.
So I was on sports teams. I don't think anyone would have ever used the word athlete to describe me. I definitely was more of the debate, theater. That was the other great thing about being in a small town. You could be on the football team and on the debate team. So that was kind of fun. But I think I was definitely someone who was more academically bent than athletic, but I always loved sports. I was definitely also someone who, I think I just loved people. That's kind of always been something that I've enjoyed. And so I just loved being with my friends, with my classmates. And so if you say what kind of guy was Steve in high school, I think it would be like someone who just liked being with everyone. And I definitely had friends that I was close with, but I really genuinely liked pretty much everybody that I went to high school with.
That's pretty cool.
So yeah, that was probably my big thing, was just being with people.
Cool. So did you go to, it was seminary first?
Okay. So
right after high school? Or?
Yeah. So after high school, I went to a little Baptist school in Abilene called Hardin-Simmons University. Okay. That was where I met my wife. She was a year younger than me, and we met, I believe, her first day on campus. The school was very small, but we didn't date until till I graduated and she was a senior. My senior, right after I graduated, Hardin-Simmons had a tiny seminary. And by tiny, I mean, I think like when I was part of the graduate program there, 70 students. So not large. So I was technically part of what they called the Logsdon School of Theology, which was like attached kind of in a weird way to the seminary. But it was, I mean, all on the same campus. So I saw Joy a lot at that point, and that was when we started dating. After that was whenever we moved to Waco, and I did a little bit of graduate school at Baylor at Waco before jumping into ministry really full time.
Okay. So age-wise, because we want to dive in where you hit this moment at 22, was that while you were in seminary, or was that at Baylor?
It was while I was in seminary. Joy and I were dating, and while in seminary, I became the pastor of a small church. And this church was essentially, whenever I became the pastor, not entirely retirees, but almost entirely retirees. So I'm 22. I become the pastor of this church of people that are predominantly in their 60s and 70s. And because the church was so small, I ended up just in this space where I was able to go see people. Like I would go visit most members of the congregation every week. So I had all of this time to read, to study my Bible. And it was in the middle of that like I just kind of had this awakening when I was spending all of this time with the Lord.
And was it just in Scripture, or like what was it, do you think, that led to that?
A couple of things. One was I was spending a ton of time in prayer, a ton of time in Scripture, but I read a couple of books that explained just God's love and God's grace. And I think it was really the first time that I understood how deeply I've been loved. And I don't know if you've ever had an experience like this, Chad, but so this church out in the middle of nowhere, I'm the only person in the building. I'm reading my Bible, I'm praying. And I mean, I just felt this like deep warmth. I don't really know how else to explain it, all over me. And I just started to weep. I mean, almost uncontrollably.
Wow.
Just, I knew that I was loved. And nothing had happened. You know, there was no tragedy going on in my life. At that point, Joy and I were engaged. I knew that I was going to marry her. I had a job. I had a career trajectory, so to speak. But I was just overwhelmed by God's love. And I just started to cry. And that's one of those moments I go back to and just remember God was present. He was present.
So leading up to that, do you remember having kind of almost like hit a sweet spot where you were kind of growing in faith, or like living more obediently, and then you hit that spot and all of a sudden?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is good, but I, prior to that, had been in a season of intense doubt. I was preaching, but really struggling, wondering sometimes wondering, do I actually believe what I'm preaching? A lot of things had happened, and particularly one of those being just kind of aware of the fact that many people that I knew in my life were rejecting Jesus. And I was grappling with eternity and the reality of eternity. And also I was watching people that had been, in my mind, Christians, now begin to say, I don't really buy into that. And so I was asking myself if I bought into that. And I think as part of that, I read some books. The internet was still pretty new in those days, but if I sat with a dial-up modem, I could load some pages and read some skeptics and that kind of thing. And so I read a lot of opposing perspectives. And it was this moment where I really wrestled, and coming through that, I was reading scripture, I think looking for knowledge, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I was gaining knowledge. So back to your question of, was I more disciplined? Yes. But what it was funny was that I was gaining all of this knowledge, but it wasn't really the knowledge that changed anything. It was then when I had that experience. It was mm-hmm. when the Holy Spirit came over me. I felt the love of God. And it was that was a moment when I said, this is real. And I don't know if that makes sense to your listeners, but all of the knowledge in the world, and I'm a pretty cerebral individual. I mean, I definitely am a feeler too, but the knowledge didn't change me. But that is something that I look back on, and I just know God met me in that place.
You know, I listened to that, and again, I'm just like, you know, you may have been in a place of doubting, but you were stepping towards God in kind of like obedience,
yes,
to learn more, to find out, to prove. And then God just said, okay, I'm going to show you.
I don't know if this makes sense, but in my life, there's a few stories and moments in the Bible that just come up regularly. Mm. My call to ministry was definitely Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord. And that image of wrestling has come up at different points for different reasons in my faith journey. Hmm. And that was one of those moments where I look and I think I was really wrestling with God. And sort of like with Jacob, God can end it whenever he's ready. But there's this weird thing. Whenever I was being called to the ministry, I wrestled and wrestled until finally I was ready to surrender. And I think the same thing with that moment. I had reached the end of myself. Mm. And I think finally when I did, God said, okay, now let me show you something that you can never study enough to have. And that's just to know me.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So your call to be in ministry, what kind of skipped over that? When did that happen?
Oh man. I mean, how long do we have here, Chad? I mean, so
we got all the time we need.
Okay. So when I was 18, most of the men in my family had gone into the military. So probably the person who was my greatest role model was my maternal grandfather. And he had been a Marine in World War II, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Bougainville. I mean, if you've ever watched the HBO miniseries, The Pacific, that's where he was.
Whoa.
And some of the stories that I heard in later years just blew my mind. He never wanted to talk about that. Just really, really incredible stuff. And horrific, honestly. But as a young man, you don't think in terms of horrific. You think in terms of awesome. Right? And so he was the person I emulated. And I thought, okay, so I want to do that. And then what do you do after you go serve in the military? Well, you go be a politician. So what I wanted to do was go serve in the military, go to law school, and then run for office. This was my plan when I was 17 to 18.
Wow.
Yeah, so no one ever accused me of having small dreams, but this was what my plan was. So I thought that I would try to get into one of the military academies and then go to law school and then go run for office. While I was 18, my church had a New Year's Eve retreat for the students. And our student ministry went, and we actually stayed in a hotel in downtown Dallas. And it was literal New Year's Eve. If I remember correctly, the next day, some of the players from, I don't know which football team, but they were staying in the same hotel that we were. They were playing in the Cotton Bowl on New Year's Day.
Cool.
So we've got, however many students. There were other churches that met there, and I don't want to exaggerate, but 200 to 300 students in this ballroom. And, we're having, doing kind of typical youth group stuff, games and music and food and all that. And there was a power outage that affected not just our hotel, but more of an area around the hotel. Don't remember if there was a storm, don't know exactly what was going on, but the power went out. And you can imagine it's New Year's Eve in Dallas, lots of people who are inebriated, and these sponsors are thinking we got to keep these kids in this room, keep them safe. So they're like, hey, everybody, don't move, that kind of a thing. And for whatever reason, being a church kid, I'm not really sure why, we're basically sitting in the dark in this hotel. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to spend some time praying. And so I started praying, and I sensed almost immediately the Lord say to me, you need to be a pastor. And I was like, well, I mean, that ain't happening. I mean, I can do a lot of things. Lord, I will serve you as an officer in the military. I will be happy to serve you as an attorney. I'll be happy to serve you running for office, but I am not going to do that as a pastor. And I mean, it was very clear that within me, I had a sense of, I want to quote unquote, be someone, be something, want to make some money, want to achieve some level of fame, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. And God just would not let me go. So in the dark, in this ballroom, I start having this wrestling with God moment. And I don't know how long it went on, but a while. And I've told this story to my sons, and they've said, was this 5 minutes? Was this 30 minutes? And I don't know. But I just remember wrestling with the Lord and then finally realizing, okay, I'm going to surrender. So I said, okay, Lord, if this is what you want me to do, I will do it. I will be a pastor. And I said, amen. And I promise you, as weird as this sounds, 5 seconds later, the lights come back on.
No way.
Yeah, no, they did. I promise you. And so for me, that's kind of like those two experiences, the one where I felt God's warmness come all over me, or warmth come all over me, and then the call to ministry. Those are two just things that I don't really have explanations for other than God met me in that place. Yeah. And so I'm a pastor.
Wow. So that's a couple of pretty significant Ebenezers that you've got stacked up before you even hit your wall.
Yes.
That's pretty cool. Okay. So, all right, let's go back to your experience. You felt God's love and grace. Is there anything significant that happens in between that and when you hit your wall? When did you hit your wall?
I hit my wall. It was not very, very far after that. I hit my wall in January of 2000. Joy and I had been married about 8 months at that point. So I was at that point 24. So I had one semester of graduate school at Baylor. Newlywed, marital bliss, because, good times whenever you're newlywed. No kids, any of that kind of stuff. So not anything hugely significant. We had moved to Waco. I'd started school, but nothing real crazy.
Okay. So what exactly then was the wall that you hit?
Yeah, it was funny, Chad, because when you first mentioned this to me, I thought of a different experience, but it was not my first wall. This was the first one. And this was the first one. Was that I became very, very ill. Joy and I went out on a date with some friends. We went to go get Tex-Mex, and we hadn't seen these friends in a couple of years. And so I remember we went to On the Border, and we sat there and we drank a whole lot of iced tea. And then I don't know, we probably visited them like 3 hours, and then they left and we went back to our house. And in the middle of the night, like 1 or 2 in the morning, I wake up and my heart is racing. And the way that I described it to people at the time was, the sensation when you're going over the first hill of a roller coaster, kind of takes your breath away. You feel that shot of adrenaline. That was exactly what I felt. And so I would feel that, and then it would calm down, and then it would happen again. And then it would calm down. And then it would happen again. And I'm just laying in bed and I'm feeling this. So I kind of prop myself up. It keeps happening. So I finally wake Joy up. I tell her what's happening. And, we're kids. We're 24. She says, you think we should go to the hospital? Maybe. I don't know. So we just load in the car. We drive over to the ER, go in, and immediately they ask me what's wrong. I tell them, they're like, oh, if you've ever been to the ER, you're having heart issues. They bring you right in. They hook me up to an EKG. The doctor comes in and he says to me, how long have you had a left bundle branch block? To which I said, I don't know what that is. And he said, you're going to see a cardiologist first thing on Monday morning. So I'll skip a little bit here, but just say that we discovered over the next few days that I had heart failure. That heart failure was caused by, most likely by a virus. That my heart was pumping, this is to use the cardiologist's words, that it was pumping about like I was a 60 to 70-year-old man. And they didn't tell me this at the time, but left untreated, their prognosis was that I would survive about 2 years.
Whoa.
Yeah. And that was a moment where my faith took a hard left turn in a lot of ways and became I would say, that first wall experience.
So, man, so many questions. Like, what were you feeling in terms of, like, you've had this experience where God's love is real.
Mm-hmm.
And then this happens.
Mm-hmm.
And like, what is your conversation with God look like?
Yeah.
In that time, or that first, month or two?
Have you ever, I don't know if you've ever gone through a season like this, but my faith prior to getting sick, I would say from kind of that awakening until that moment had been, man, I was listening to worship music, nonstop. All the time, just very sweet. And when that happened, I felt confusion. Maybe betrayal would be a good word to use to describe that. And I don't know if this makes sense, but it was kind of a moment where you think, well, did I do something wrong? Like why would this happen?
Mentality?
Exactly. Yeah. Am I being punished in this moment? Am I being disciplined? Have I sinned in some way? And I think also too, when you're 23, 24, you're newlywed, you're thinking about how great life looks from that particular vantage point.
Yeah.
The thought of getting sick goes absolutely against the grain of every other experience you've been having. So that was the part that was really, I think, confusing. So if I'll be honest with you, my prayers, I think, were confused at first. And then they kind of almost stopped for a minute because I didn't know what to pray. And if you've ever gone into a really serious diagnosis, every theological opinion and stream in the world will be thrown at you. So I had people contacting me saying, you just don't have enough faith.
Seriously, people said that.
Oh, 100%. If you would pray in faith, then God would heal you. People would come and, almost a fatalistic approach, well, God will do what God will do. Every kind of everything in between. And I think that was when my prayers felt really, really dead for a minute. And then I wish that I could tell you like a moment where they started to bubble forth, but it was more of just, well, I do know now. So I was diagnosed in January of 2000. And I think it was April, we found out that Joy was pregnant with Ben, our oldest. Yeah. And that was the moment where I realized I've got to cry out to God. And that was when crying out to God was almost, it was so raw and just so helpless that I think that it was probably maybe some of the most genuine time in prayer you could have.
Right. Yeah. Well, man, because I see this, you've been handed this insane diagnosis.
Right.
And if that's not enough to process, now you're going to be a dad.
Right.
And like, if that doesn't drive somebody to surrender and just like admit to God, I don't have the power to do this. Like, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, it was, and I think that during that time, what began to happen, it wasn't immediate. I was diagnosed in January, and probably just over the next 12 months, I just slowly declined. Okay. And just my heart function grew weaker and weaker and weaker. Joy, if she was here, could tell you exactly, but we went to the emergency room a lot. I couldn't tell you how many times. And as I was growing weaker and weaker and weaker, I had to have the conversations that you can't even believe you would have when you're in your 20s, calling my friends and saying, hey, if something happens to me, I've got this baby on the way, make sure that, he's taken care of. And the kind of stuff that you see in movies, right? You're like, this doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
And that was then this moment where it was, I got to cry out to God. Yeah.
I just got to go back for one sec to these people that are saying you're not praying with enough faith.
Right.
That just hurts me and it angers me. And it's like, have you never read Job? Like, how is that helpful? And I mean, this is just, I guess, me ranting, but like, my goodness, insensitive.
You know what's funny is that I agree with everything you just said. I don't even think that they meant it that way. I think they were genuinely trying to help. Like, hey, we've got this approach in prayer, and if you'll do it, then you'll be healed. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, it seemed like a great thing. Maybe I don't have enough faith. Whenever you've got a diagnosis that leads to death, you're kind of willing to try whatever, I guess.
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought, I did a lot of that. I remember the reading, like some of the emails and that kind of thing to Joy. And Joy's like, that's not what's going on here. I think that I was not necessarily in the right frame of mind. And I'll talk more about this if you want to, but I really think that, Joy was definitely the one that God gave me in that season to help me get through the wall. Her faith became kind of like the example for me. And I learned a lot from her in that season.
Would you say then, like when we last episode, we talked to Kirk, who you know, obviously, and he said at one point, like borrowing somebody's faith when your faith isn't, was it that kind of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that watching Joy pray in that time when I didn't know how to pray, it was almost like a recalibrating. It was watching her pray was teaching me how to pray again. And I think that I felt very unstable inside, and maybe anyone would. I'm not proud of this, Chad. Like I wanted to be the person that you get the diagnosis and you're like, well, God knows and God's got it. I just wasn't how I felt. I mean, I felt really confused and honestly in shock, a lot of shock for a bit.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until things had sort of settled in my heart that I was even able to consider responding to the Lord in that way. And then that's when I was sort of floundering a bit, and then just watching Joy would just, man, she pressed in prayer. And that was something I really needed.
So I'm sure at that time you probably weren't feeling this way, but looking back on it now, I mean, do you kind of think of that as like even in the midst of this ordeal, God provides?
Yes.
He provided you with that person to
Yes.
walk through this with.
Yes.
And yeah, that's just another extension of his love, even though we're going through something.
No doubt. And I think that anybody who might be listening to this that's in the middle of a trial, a physical diagnosis, I would tell you to look for the people around you that God has placed into your life that are present, are loving. They're telling you the truth of what Scripture says. They're telling you exactly what Jesus would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say those are exactly what you said, Chad. Those are gifts from God.
Yeah. Amen. So for our listeners who don't know this, you're not healed.
That is correct.
So my question then is, do you feel like that wall experience ended at some point, or is it an experience that has continued since then?
That is a fantastic question. I would say the initial experience ended, and the way that it ended was that, in the sense of trusting God. I think that my faith and my trust was wavering. I would say that the way that through that wall was watching Joy, and then, man, the church that was around us at that time just loved us so well. And I think we borrowed faith from them too.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely began to recognize that God's love and presence was real. So in that sense, I think that we did move through that place of wondering, God, do you see us? Do you love us? That was clear. And we've gone back to that many times through other trials and said, no, God's here. He's real. We know that because we have this experience in our past. Mm-hmm. Even when now sometimes we go through things, we don't have signs that are quite as visible. We know. Mm-hmm. The piece that hasn't gone away has been the uncertainty of life and death. And I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I'm 48, but in my mind, I should, on paper, get to live longer. However, to your point, Chad, I'm not healed, so that's up to the Lord.
Right.
And so I think that the piece that is always ongoing is just recognizing that every day is a gift and to try to live like that. And the truth is some days I do great and other days not so great.
So if you're willing to share, would you mind giving us an update on where things are at right now?
Yeah. So the measurement that they watch is called ejection fraction, which is the percentage of blood your left ventricle pumps with each heartbeat. And healthy is anything 55% or higher. I've been told that really, anything above like 70 is pretty rare, but apparently some people do have that. So the range is, you can't get much higher than 55% is where I'm headed with that.
Okay.
When I was diagnosed, my ejection fraction was at 20, and the doctors were stunned that I was out of bed.
Whoa.
They said, we honestly, people who have 20, like they're not out of bed. They're not out walking around. So that's still to me kind of a mini miracle. Not really even sure how that happened.
Yeah.
Over time, I was part of a clinical trial. I received a device that was implanted in my chest, medications. over time, that function gradually crept up over the course of many years to where it got to 55, the very bottom end of healthy. And then about a year ago, on a Sunday morning, I just noticed some shortness of breath. We went to the cardiologist, and I had a big drop. So I'd gone from 55 to 45. No one knows why. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. The words that the doctor used were new stressors as you age, whatever that means. So
I think I've felt those.
yeah, I think we all do, right? So that has gone down, and it hasn't gone back up. I've been on a new round of drugs for about a year, and that it's held steady at 45, but it hasn't gone back.
Okay. So you're still functioning as you would, or have you noticed a change in your energy or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely less energy than I had a year ago. Definitely better than I was when I was first diagnosed. But yeah, I get tired more easily. Can't do as many things as I used to, but just trying to manage that and move forward.
This just came to me, and it might be completely unrelated. But for anybody listening to this who's not aware, you've been the pastor at Houston Northwest for how long now?
11 years and 3 months.
Okay. All right. So during that time, you have led the church through the Harvey flood.
Yes.
That impacted our campus pretty significantly.
Yes.
And then also through the COVID, if you want to call it epidemic.
Yes.
Do you suppose, were those stressful situations for you?
Very much. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if there's any connection.
I mean, that's what Joy and I hypothesize. We don't really know.
Right.
But both of those were just, either one of those would have been something you would never want to live through again. Right. And they basically came back to back. The flood hit 2017. We lived through that. Then for your listeners, we then had to rebuild a massive chunk of our church because it was destroyed by the hurricane. So we had an impromptu fundraiser and then an impromptu building project. And we were trying to operate like a church plant in the middle of that because we didn't have the facilities we were used to. And we opened about 8 weeks before the world shut down again. So it was like we got to the end, wiped the dust off our hands, said, okay, let's get back to normal. And then boom, COVID.
Man.
Yeah, not fun on either front.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Like what a 5-6 year journey you've had.
Yeah, it was kind of wild. I'm hoping that that's the end of that, no doubt.
Yeah. Okay, so then I guess coming out the other side of that wall, I think you mentioned some of the things that became apparent to you. What was the greatest? Because usually God takes us through that to either show us something or strip something out of us. Do you think, because you said that you got an appreciation now for life.
Yeah.
Do you feel like through that there was anything that God potentially was trying to refine out of you?
Yeah.
Or, yeah?
I do. I think that the biggest thing was, maybe a couple of things. Number one, I think that appreciation of life was where I started, but I think when you begin to appreciate life, it teaches you to appreciate love more. I'm a big fan of excellence. I want to do the best I can at anything that I'm a part of, including my job, my marriage, my raising of my sons, any project that I work on. But I will confess that sometimes my commitment to excellence in the past led me to not really understand how precious the people in my life are. And I think that God has taught me that whenever you reach a point when you recognize that any day could be your last, it changes your priorities. And particularly the way that you think about people. And I don't know if there's anybody who's listening to this that can relate to this, but I was definitely guilty of times where I would tell my kids, leave me alone. I got to work on something right now. I'll get to you later. And I was giving my best energy to things that I didn't have to. I felt the same way about some of my friendships, and particularly my relationship with my siblings, in the sense that I always had something that was really important in my mind that I was working on. And just the longer that I've walked with disease, the more that I've come to appreciate, if I get a call or a text message from a family member, if I have the opportunity to welcome them into my home, my kids are college age right now. They're not real great at advanced planning. They just show up and breeze in and out of my life. And if I have the opportunity to eat with them, or for them to say, hey, I was thinking about coming home this weekend. The way that I am wired naturally would be, I had some plans, I had some things I wanted to do. And sometimes I can't get out of those, Chad, but man, soaking up time with my kids, huge. I'm not proud of this, but early in our marriage, I was definitely someone who could fall prey to elevating ministry above my children and above my wife. And, the thought was, well, we're doing stuff for Jesus here,
Right.
Eternity hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
And I would just tell you that now, man, I love my church. I love the Lord, but giving time to joy, giving time to the boys, giving time to my family, to friends, that has become something I way more value than I ever did 20 years ago.
Yeah. I would think, just based on my limited experience, there's a couple of pastors in our family, extended family, and I would say that probably that issue impacts more pastors than we would estimate. What do you think?
Yeah, there's no doubt. I think that what happens in ministry is that any church that you see that you would say that's a quote unquote successful church probably has at least one staff member, if not multiple, who are probably workaholics. Because the way that church stuff goes a lot of times is based on the energy of the leader. And if anything, pushing through that wall and growing in my faith has taught me that I need to believe what I say I believe, which is that God is building the church, not Steve. And I think that it's really easy for those of us in ministry to not believe that and to think, man, I've got to prove myself. I'm proving myself to the church, proving myself to my peers, maybe proving myself to a family member. And I just think, man, it's easy to get caught in that cycle of thinking. And I think it's good for us to rest in the fact that, not to be lazy, but to rest in the fact that we do what we can, that is within reason, and then trust the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. We could do a whole podcast just on that topic alone, I think. So
no doubt. We could talk a long time about that.
Maybe we'll just leave that one. So you piqued my interest because you had thought initially of a different wall.
Yeah.
Do you want to, can we talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I think that the other probably formative experience for me was just my relationship with my father. So after my parents got divorced, and I want to be clear, this is This is in no way any disrespect towards my father. And I want to start by saying he loves Jesus. He's a good man. I do think, though, that whenever I was a child and the divorce had happened, I think he didn't really know how to handle that. Looking back, he was probably about the same age, maybe, a little older. When I had my heart incident, that he and my mom got divorced, he might have been, I think he was 19 or 20 maybe when they got married. So maybe he was like 20, maybe 26, 27. I mean, something like that.
Wow.
The point being, I don't want this to be perceived as me faulting him. It's not that at all. But because he didn't really know how to navigate that, after he remarried, he moved to the Austin area for work. And as a result, then we didn't see one another very much. And, this is in the days before cell phones. Mm-hmm. Do you remember these days when you had to pay to make a long distance call and that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. And so I just didn't see him a lot, and I didn't talk to him a lot. And I'm not proud of this, but that built up a resentment in my heart. And I think that as time went on, he was in a position where he didn't really know, how do you overcome that? My mom remarried eventually. This other, man, my stepdad, who also incredible man, is raising me. I don't know that he really knew how to engage at that point. Yeah. I think maybe he felt like the best plan was to kind of take a step back so as to not confuse me. And all of those emotional aspects just sort of were churning inside of me, wondering about what was my relationship with my dad. And, so it's just a weird in-between space. So, I'm living with my mom and my stepdad, who I know both love me very, very much, but also there's this, so I don't know how to explain it. Like it was no doubt that I was loved, but then there was also just this piece where it was like, without that kind of grounding relationship with my dad, it was creating some emotional churn inside of me. Mm-hmm. So the wall was experiencing that to a point where many years later, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly how old I was. I was about 30. Joy and I had 2 sons at this point, and he called me and he asked me if we could go to lunch. And we did. I could take you to the restaurant, to the table. And he asked me to forgive him for basically not having been present in my life for, 20-ish years. And he wanted to know my sons. He wanted to be a grandfather. And I am not proud of this, but I felt deep anger at him in that moment. Mm. And I look back and I think he was being so courageous. I mean, can you imagine how hard it would be to come to your kid and to ask forgiveness? And so I know that he was humbling himself. I know that was courageous, but man, I was mad. Yeah. And the place where we ate was a Chinese restaurant that had white linen tablecloths. And, my hand was under the table, just balling that tablecloth in my hand because I was just furious. And I kind of had this moment where I just wanted to flip the table over. I was so mad. And it's irrational in a lot of ways, but it was real. And the reason I call that a wall, it was almost instantaneous, like it had been building, but then this was the moment of decision. Mm. Because I remember what happened in that moment was then suddenly the Holy Spirit just spoke to me and said, do you actually believe what you've been preaching? Hmm. Do you believe in grace? Do you believe in forgiveness? And my grip loosened, and I told him that I received his apology. And I don't want to act like our relationship, magically was healed in that moment, but man, it is way better than it was, almost 20 years ago. My kids, man, they love him. They don't have any weirdness with them, any animosity. His courage to ask for forgiveness brought healing into that relationship. And my willingness to trust the Lord knew best also brought healing. And that was a wall that I didn't really see coming. It was something that was building inside of me, but it wasn't until I got to it and I said yes, that we were able to move past it.
Wow. I mean, that's probably obviously not a common experience, but a common theme in quite a few men.
Yeah.
Of some kind of hurt with a father, either absent or abusive or whatever it is, that really leaves a mark,
no doubt,
significant mark. So that is pretty, because I don't think it's the common thing for the father to approach the son.
No,
it's usually the other way around from my experience, but that's pretty phenomenal. That was really cool.
It's been transformative. I would just tell you about it. About right at a year ago, I got to go to Israel with him and my stepmom, and he asked me to baptize him in the Jordan River as just sort of an act of almost like reconciliation. Everybody was crying. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
Man,
so
that's beautiful.
I hold his courage in that moment in high regard and high esteem. Yeah.
Fantastic. So before we let you go, pastors always have the best miracle stories, if you would. And I've heard you talk about a couple from, the pulpit about just unexplainable things that happened. And I love hearing them. So if you can think of one that comes to mind, I mean, you've probably got dozens, but if there was one that you would share with our listeners.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'll give you one that is just, more in our church. But probably the few that come to mind in our church, just immediately that come to mind are healing. There's a woman who very recently passed away, who I was her pastor for 11 years, and she had cancer that entire time. Oh, wow. And the number of times that she would say, well, they tell me this is it, was, I think, 5 times over the last 11 years. But there was one where I remember where they said that she had a brain tumor and it was terminal, and they were going to take out as much as they could, but no doubt that it would be terminal. And she came to the church, and we laid hands on her and we prayed for her. And then the next day was her procedure. And she went to the hospital, and they wanted to do a scan so they could, I guess, mark maybe exactly where they needed to make the incision. I'm not really sure what exactly was happening there, but they wanted to do another scan. And when they did it, I mean, it was gone. It went from you're terminal, we're going to do the best we can here, to there is no reason to have surgery. And that was, for me, probably the coolest story, because, I mean, she's calling, she's crying, we're crying. I mean, it was just amazing. Another one that's been really neat has been in the church. I don't want to exaggerate, so I'm going to say 3 or 4 times for sure. Families who have been struggling with infertility have come and requested prayer. And, basically they've gone through whatever treatments, and then they just come and have been prayed over. And I've been blessed to be part of this, but others too. And the coolest experience was this family came out to our we call it the back porch, our greeting area. And I just got to visit with them, and they shared what was going on, and they were, just distraught. And I, let's pray, and laid hands on them and prayed for them. And, about 9.5 months later, they come strolling out to the back porch like, hey, here you go. Check this out. And they're holding up a baby. And they said, basically, right after you prayed for us, like we got pregnant like 2 weeks later. Oh. And those are the kinds of things that, you know, like you said, the Ebenezer's that you stack up and you say, God, I know that you're in the middle of this. Yeah. And so those are just a couple that come to mind pretty quick, Chad.
Yeah, those are so good. I love those. All right. Do you want to give us kind of a little bit of a preview, if you will, or a synopsis of your book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned in the beginning, the title is Your Jesus is Too American. And the idea is that all of us mix our culture with our faith. We don't mean to, but we just do.
Yeah.
And so I think that in the United States, our trouble is like we're so successful as a nation. We're affluent. We have tons of options. We're very successful. And so I think that we can't help but view our faith through that lens of affluence and success. And so I preached a sermon series 2 to 3 years ago called The Backwards Way of Jesus.
I remember that.
Okay. And I just wanted to take that sermon series and say, what would it look like if we said, what does Jesus teach us about things that Americans think they have the answers to? So the book talks about power, money, sex, politics, racism, suffering, all those kinds of things. And what I do is I kind of say, this is what Americans tend to think about these topics, but here's what Jesus says about those topics. So the idea is to say, let's be discipled by Jesus, not by American culture. That's kind of the short answer.
Man, I can't wait. I've got mine pre-ordered, so I'm waiting patiently.
Well, thank you.
To dig in. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks, Chad. I appreciate it.
Any parting word before we wrap up here that you would share as encouragement?
Oh man, I would just say this is fantastic. I think that over the years, what I've discovered is that sermons are great, but people's stories resonate. And you taking the time to sit down with people and capture stories and let people share those stories and then get those stories out, that will change lives. And I think that I can't even imagine how God's going to use this. I'm excited. So thank you for doing it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We certainly hope it does make an impact. So,
yeah, I think it will.
Cool. All right. Well, if this episode has spoken to you, if you've been touched by part of Steve's story or by all of it, please give us a like or a thumbs up or whatever it is on the platform that you're watching on, and just help us to get this word out more. Thanks very much. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Sad. It was great.